Hello and welcome to the World War II True Crime series with Mark Ellis. I'm your host, Oliver Webb-Carter, and we are talking to best-selling author Mark about the rampant crime in London during the Second World War. Our first episode is the wartime crime bonanza. So Mark, I wanted to ask you first, why did you want to write about this subject during the Second World War?
Well, thanks for having me on this podcast, Ollie. To answer your question, it's really family which has developed my interest in World War II. I was born in 1953, and both my parents went through the war. My mother is a teenager and my father a little bit older, and he went to war. He was in the Navy and he was sent to West Africa, where he unfortunately contracted a lung disease. It didn't kill him straight off. It was a long wasting disease. So I was unable to be born, and he eventually died in 1960 when I was 7. So that simple fact meant that World War II loomed over me in a major way during my childhood. Apart from that, my mother, who thankfully lived a long, fruitful life, used to tell me interesting stories about World War II. She lived in Llanelli in South Wales, from which could be seen in the distance the town of Swansea, where actually I grew up. And during the war, Swansea, as a major port, was very heavily bombed by the Germans, and she would watch it from her garden, which was on a hill in Llanelli, and that was just a rather striking image to me. Over and above that, she worked for the Great Western Railway and used to get free tickets, which she could use to come up to London to trip the Light Fantastic with her friends, which she did, and she did it in years like 1944, when the V2 bombs were floating around, and I used to ask her, well, why would you take the risk if there were bombs around? And she would say, well, the Germans aren't going to stop me having a life. And so that sort of raised interesting questions in me about what life was really like on the home front. And obviously people got killed in the war, got bombed, but also people went on with their normal lives as best they could. So that was the principal factor for me to develop an interest in World War II and perhaps more specifically in World War II and life on the home front, which obviously encompasses crime.
Yeah, so very much a personal interest here, Mark. So crime is what we're talking about, particularly in this first episode. We're talking the bonanza of crime. Why was crime so prevalent?
Well, there are a number of reasons which I'm happy to elaborate on. And if you give me a moment, I'll do that. But first off, I'd like to say that people are always very surprised that there was a wartime crime boom. I think they tended to believe that criminals, like everyone else through the war, offered a stiff upper lip and toned down their activities to contribute to the war effort. But the exact opposite was the case. As a famous wartime mobster said, echoing Harold Macmillan, "Why did that bastard Hitler have to give in? We were having such a great time in the war." Crime in England and Wales grew almost 60% between 1939 and 1945. And there were increases in major and minor crimes pretty much across the board. An interesting observation on wartime crime was made by that same gangster I quoted a moment ago. Frankie Fraser, or Mad Frankie Fraser, as he later became known, was 20 in 1943 when he was called up. He wasn't interested in going into the army, so he went underground in Notting Hill. This is what he had to say about wartime crime, and I'm not going to attempt the appropriate accent. The war organised criminals before war thieving. I'm just joking there, okay? The war organised criminals. Before the war, thieving was safes, jewellery, furs. Now a whole new world was opened up. There was so much money and stuff about. Cigarettes, sugar, clothes, petrol and clothing coupons, anything. It was a thieves' paradise. I was a thief. Everyone was a thief. People who I'd known before the war at the races, who were villains but who weren't thieves, now they were. They'd been called up and didn't fancy the army, so they were on the run. They couldn't make money at the races because they were the first place people would look for them. And so they turned to thieving. And some of them turned out to be very good thieves and all. So it was a whole new world. Anyway, now I'll get on and answer your question as to why crime was so prevalent in the war, after which I'll go into the detail concerning the main categories of wartime crime, such as murder, theft, looting, vice, black market crimes, and other wartime scams. Gangs played a major part in wartime crime, particularly in London, but they'll be getting their own episode as will the American impact on and involvement in wartime crime.
Fantastic. So should we start with the reasons for this 60% increase in crime I think you've mentioned, which is just an extraordinary figure. So there must be factors driving that.
Among the principal factors was the blackout. This was introduced in 1939 and required everyone to install blackout curtains and keep them closed at night. In addition, all street lighting was off. The purpose for this, for younger listeners, was to make the German bombers' job much harder.
Regardless of crime, the introduction of the blackout naturally caused huge problems for people, particularly in the early days of the war when they were less used to it. The blackout was actually introduced on September the 1st, 1939, 2 days before war was declared. During the first 4 months of its operation, nighttime road accident deaths in London doubled, and the incidence of car accidents generally took off. The number of personal accidents causing broken bones or worse also grew. Arthur Christiansen, the legendary editor of the huge circulation Daily Express, fell in the blackout and broke his leg in 5 places. He was in plaster for 6 months. There were other hazards too. Well ahead of the Nazi bombs, an IRA bombing campaign in 1939 and 1940 saw scores of bombs planted and detonated under cover of the blackout.
Clearly, the blackout made it easier for major and minor crimes to be committed, and was in itself a cause of criminality, as it was illegal not to close your curtains. The regulations were incredibly complex. Under the emergency powers lighting provisions, there were 33 articles and scores of sub-articles. And in the case of the blackout, ignorance of the law was no excuse, so many people fell foul of the regulations. The regulations were strictly applied throughout the war, even towards the end of the war, when there was no real threat from actual bombers, but rather threat from V2 rockets, for which the blackout was irrelevant. One example, towards the end of the war, a young mother rushed to her child's bedroom where the child was having some form of fit. In her panic, when she turned the light on, she forgot to make sure the curtains were closed. Regardless of the circumstances, she was prosecuted and fined. The second major factor behind the huge crime boom was wartime regulations themselves, which included obviously the blackout. But the criminality was increased because of the introduction of a vast number of wartime regulations. Under the Emergency Powers Defence Act of 1939, all existing laws were effectively set aside, and regulation of wartime life was effected through orders in council under the Act. Through this legislation, the government was given draconian powers, including the right to enter and search any premises, prosecute and punish offenders, and to detain indefinitely those whose detention appears expedient. Thus, habeas corpus was suspended for the duration. Apart from these fundamental legal changes, over the course of the war, hundreds, if not thousands, of regulations were introduced, the breach of which would be a criminal offence. Best known, of course, of the wartime regulations, apart from the blackout, were the provisions for the rationing of various items. The principal items subject to rationing were foodstuffs, clothing and petrol, and in food terms it was bacon and ham, butter, cheese, margarine, cooking fat, milk, sugar, jam, tea and eggs. Apart from food, clothing and petrol, other items rationed included razor blades, because metal supplies were of vital importance to the war effort, soap and cosmetics, which involved chemicals which again might be needed for the war effort, and paper. Food rationing was regulated by ration books issued to everyone, and every household had to register with a local butcher, grocer and milkman, and they had to make sure they had enough food for their customers. Matters were further complicated by the government introducing price controls as the war went on. Other rationing was governed in a similar way by a coupon system. Of course, the whole system was subject to criminal exploitation, as I'll go on to explain. But people could also get into trouble for honest mistakes. Again, ignorance of the law was no defence. Many other things were subject to regulation. For example, striking was banned. In one particular instance, there was a coal strike at Bettishanger in Kent. A new coal face had opened, which was harder to mine. Miners were unable to meet their quotas and were not paid the agreed minimum wages by their bosses. Arbitration failed and they went on strike. Prosecutions of over 1,000 men were issued, and 3 union officials were sent to prison, and everyone else was fined. This whole process was extraordinarily unpopular throughout the country and not conducive to good morale. So the government realized it couldn't really do this sort of thing, and the imprisoned officials were pardoned and fines remitted. And so the teeth of the legislation against striking were pulled fairly early on in the war. Other things that were regulated: you could be breaking the law if you didn't turn up to work in certain industries. Persistent absenteeism was finable, and indeed there were other harsher penalties. Driving was regulated, and effectively private driving was banned halfway through the war, although people with money and influence could obviously find ways.
So I think we're getting an idea of the climate during the war in Britain. One area that I'm sure will interest listeners is sex and crime. Could you talk a bit about that, Mark?
By 1944, there were over 3 million men in the Home Armed Forces and over 1.5 million American GIs in Britain. Thus, there was a huge market during the war for the provision of sexual services. Soldiers would come on their leaves into places like London looking for a good time. This was an area which in London was dominated by Maltese gangs. I won't go into the Maltese gangs at this point, as that's going to come in the London Gangland episode. So, these are some of the reasons for the wartime crime bonanza. Now I'll move on to the specifics of wartime crime.
Yes, you've drawn a very interesting picture of life in Britain at the time, particularly crime. It seems almost prevalent, even if you inadvertently are committing crimes. But I wonder if we can focus now on some of the more violent crimes, and more specifically murders.
Yes, of course. And there were some very notorious murders during the war, murderers. And in some cases, the wartime conditions served to facilitate their crimes. One example, the blackout was ideal for people like serial killers. Gordon Cummins was a young airman who enjoyed assaulting, mutilating and murdering young women. The pitch-dark streets afforded him perfect cover. At least 4 victims fell prey to him between 1941 and 1942 before he was caught and hanged. The press nicknamed him the Blackout Ripper. Then moving on, another case in which wartime conditions might be said to have borne on the crime. Some murderers tried to use the cover of German bombing and the Blitz to mask their crimes. Harry Dobkin was one such. Knowing that with so many people being killed in the Blitz, it was impossible for every dead body found in the rubble to be investigated, he strangled his wife Rachel and buried her in the ruins of a bombed church in Vauxhall. He was confident that if found, the body would be identified as an air raid victim. Unluckily for him, when the body was found over a year later, the pathologist was still able to determine that the broken bone in her throat was the result of strangulation. He went to the gallows. One question arising from the Dobkins case is, although he was caught, how many murderers tried the same trick and got away with it? Although he was executed for the post-war murder of his wife, John Christie was known to have murdered several others during the war and after, and may well have got away with other crimes. One shocking piece of information about John Christie is that he served as a special constable during the war. Perhaps one of the most notorious wartime murderers, if not the most notorious, was John George Haigh, ultimately known as the acid bath murderer. Again, war circumstances partly helped him in the first of his crimes. In 1944, he met up with an old acquaintance, William McSwan, who'd made some money. McSwan volunteered that he was going to go underground in order to avoid the draft. Haigh and McSwan began to meet regularly, and Haigh was introduced to McSwan's parents. Haigh had some unusual interests. He had a vampiric desire to drink blood, and he was also interested in the action of sulfuric acid on flesh. On the 9th of September 1944, McSwan visited Haigh in a workshop Haigh rented on the Gloucester Road. Haigh hit McSwan with a cosh, cut his throat, and then drank a glassful of his blood. He took McSwan's wallet, ID card and other valuable items, then dissolved the body in a 40-gallon barrel of sulfuric acid and poured the resulting sludge down a drain.
He then forged letters whereby he managed to steal McSwan's properties and other valuable items.
When the parents began to worry about where McSwan was, they asked Haigh if he knew. Haigh was able to refer to McSwan's desire to go underground in order to avoid the draft. When their persistence became too great, he invited them to visit him and did to them what he'd done to their son. Then he proceeded in the same way to ransack their possessions and assets to his own benefit. He went on to kill a number of others before eventually he was hanged in 1949. An aside here to do with Britain's public executioner. Britain's hangman during the war and after was Yorkshireman Albert Pierpoint. Hanging ran in the family. His father and uncle were both hangmen. He hanged 3 of the 4 murderers I've just mentioned, Gordon Cummins, John Christie and John Haig. He was the executioner of hundreds of German war criminals. He executed William Joyce, otherwise known as Lord Haw-Haw, and he executed Ruth Ellis, the last woman to be hanged in Britain. He was also the hangman of John Amory, the son of Conservative Cabinet Minister Leo Amory, who had been a Nazi sympathiser during the war and was thus convicted of treason. He called John Amory the bravest man he had ever executed. He insisted on shaking hands with his executioner and told him that he'd wanted to meet him, although not under these circumstances.
A murderer who Pierpoint didn't get his hands on was a young man from Essex called Eric Brown. This murder is an example of the war itself providing the means for the crime. Brown was called up in 1942 and served in the Suffolk Regiment. Eric's father, Archibald, had been crippled and confined to a wheelchair when still a young man. 47 in 1943, he had become a domineering, over-demanding bully. In July of that year, Eric Brown, 20, came home from his regiment on compassionate leave. He'd always been regarded as a strange boy, prone to mood swings which were difficult to deal with. Archibald liked to be taken out every day in his bath chair. On July the 23rd, he was taken out by one of his carers, Nurse Mitchell. About a mile from the house, there was a huge explosion, and Archibald Brown was blown to smithereens. One leg was found 15 feet up a nearby tree, and the other in a garden 50 feet away. The police investigated and found that Eric had stolen a grenade from his barracks storehouse, in the working of which he'd been trained, and had attached it to the bath chair with a mechanism which would make it go off on the chair after a short while. Eric Brown didn't get an appointment with Pierpoint for what became known as the bath chair murder. He was found guilty but insane at Essex Assizes. He was released in 1975, having spent 32 years in a psychiatric hospital.
Moving on now to another major crime, looting. People today still seem very surprised to learn that looting was rife in London during the Blitz. To put some figures on it, during the 4 months of the London Blitz through to the end of December 1940, 4,584 looting cases were brought before the judges in the Old Bailey. The simple fact is that when buildings were destroyed, a significant number of looters were around to scavenge the ruins. Householders might return to their damaged houses after a night in an air raid shelter and find them completely stripped of furniture and valuables. It was not just the criminal classes who participated in looting. In fact, many of the professional criminals looked down on looting and looters. The guilty parties, however, as a review of the Old Bailey cases shows, consisted not just of private citizens, but shockingly also policemen, wardens, emergency services people, and ambulancemen. Some wanted looting to be a capital offence, but generally speaking a 3 to 6 month prison sentence was the norm. Here are a few unpleasant looting stories. On the 8th of March 1941, the West End club, the Café de Paris, took a direct hit from a German bomb. The club was packed and there were many casualties. 34 people were killed and around 80 injured. When emergency services arrived, they found a large number of looters present who were seeking to strip the dead and injured of their jewels and other valuables. Many were fighting with each other for their share of the spoils. Another instance, it was not unknown for people lying injured in the ruins of a bombed house to be robbed by looters. In the latter stages of the war, a V2 bomb hit a public library in Hackney and damaged surrounding buildings. 3 men who were involved in clearing the damage took the opportunity to steal from a bomb-damaged shop, while the woman shopkeeper lay trapped beneath the wreckage. Another clearance worker, Albert Taylor, in a similar situation, actually offered violence to an injured woman as he stole cash and jewellery from her. And there are many other horrific looting stories. Moving on to another big category of crime, robbery, burglary and theft. The big London gangs had a great time robbing and stealing in the war. That's for the next episode. Plenty of other criminals took advantage of the favourable wartime conditions to make hay. One particular advantage was that the Metropolitan Police were very stretched. Obviously, a lot of good young officers joined the forces. Many special constables were recruited, but their quality was not necessarily great. For example, as I mentioned earlier, the serial killer John Christie was one of those special constables. Crooks made raids on banks and jewellery shops, on fur shops and warehouses. Furs were particularly interesting to criminals because no new furs were being created, and so there was a shortage. All sorts of items that were in short supply could be the subject of warehouse raids or lorry hijacks and so on. Items such as cigarettes, spirits, cosmetics, paper, and razor blades. Of course, much of the robbery and stealing was prompted by the requirements of the black market, which was thriving in the shortages of war and the strictly regulated wartime world. Ration books, clothing, and petrol coupons had great value and were the subject of robberies and armed raids and the like, and of course, forgery. Some examples. In 1944, in the north of England, criminals stole 14,000 newly issued ration books and then sold them in the black market for a total estimated profit of £70,000, which would be equivalent to approximately £3 million today. So there was plenty of money in this. In another case, criminals produced a large amount of forged clothing coupons. The going black market rate on the street for one forged coupon was £10 or £400 in today's money. Crooks didn't always have it their own way, however. In 1943, there was a heist in which 5 million brand new clothing coupons were stolen. It would be enough to service 250,000 people. The amount was so huge that the government invalidated the whole batch and the thieves were thwarted. Other areas of theft, pilfering from employers, was also a big problem. Shortages made people desperate, and even the most genteel of people were apprehended stealing. The post office facilities were particularly affected by this pilfering, as were railway stations, and it took something of an act of faith to send a parcel anywhere.
So Mark, that's all fascinating. And I guess this leads us on to the next area, which is the black market and scams. So what was the black market looking like, and what were the sort of scams that were being carried out?
Well, the black market was dominated by some of the London gangs, and clearly the rationing, coupons, books and so on offered a huge amount of opportunity. In addition, these shortages of all these various products offered huge scope for people to make vast amounts of money, and vast amounts of money were indeed made. But the black market scams were not the only scams. There were other wartime scams. It's a small step for the world of black market corruption to the other sorts of scams which took place in wartime. Among the most notorious were, first of all, the refugee scam. London was awash with European refugees. Most had had bad experiences with their own police forces and were naturally petrified at the sight of a police uniform. Where refugees had sometimes been able to set themselves up domestically in a comfortable way, criminals dressed up as police officers visited them and told them that they were required to attend the police station. Naturally, fearful of the authority, they went. While they were away, the associates of the criminals moved in to clear the house of all its valuables. Other scams included medical scams. Obviously, many men did not want to go to war and join the army and wanted to avoid the draft. So these were opportunities to others. There were corrupt doctors available to provide false medical certificates. There were also people with ailments like gammy legs or heart conditions prepared to impersonate others at medical boards. One man called Jack Brack used to charge as much as £200 to do this service. And another scam was building scams. Obviously, there was a huge amount of investment in the war in things like air raid shelters, and most of the responsibility for putting these up was with local councils. In one case, officials in Hammersmith Council gave a contract for shelters to a friendly builder for a kickback. The builder cut corners on the job, and when bombs hit the shelter, it collapsed and many died. The council officials went to prison. Now moving on to the last of the major crime categories, vice, in which I'm incorporating gambling and drinking. As mentioned earlier, vice in London was very much a Maltese affair in gang terms. However, it obviously went on outside their ambit too. The great numbers of soldiers looking for a fun night out in London obviously drew prostitutes from all over, not to mention fun-seeking members of the opposite sex in general. The hordes of prostitutes swarming around London's West End were given the affectionate name of the Piccadilly Commandos, and another name they went by was the Hyde Park Rangers.
One of the main high-end public locations for prostitutes was Shepherd's Market in Mayfair. Many of the professionals congregating there were foreigners. As the war went on, the demand grew and grew in London particularly. Working conditions for even the high-end girls became more and more difficult. A French prostitute called Martha Watts reported that her employers insisted she allow each client only 10 minutes and no clothes were to be removed.
There are obviously many nightclubs and brothels. There were also bottle parties offering illicit and often dangerous spirits, and there were instances of people actually going blind at these clubs.
One very well-known hostess nightclub, which doubled as a bottle club, was the Court Club, which was to be found behind the Cumberland Hotel in Marble Arch. It was not cheap and thus was mostly patronized by American soldiers. Membership cost 10 shillings plus a 10 shillings entrance fee. A fifth of scotch, home-produced or otherwise, cost £4 10 shillings, and soda water and a bowl of ice could be had for 5 shillings more. Bear in mind that the rule of thumb present-day value of these sums is times 40.
There were also many private gambling clubs. These often moved from private flat to flat, as they were only illegal if the places used could be described as habitual.
Of course, prostitution was not exclusively heterosexual, and there were many homosexual prostitutes plying their trade in World War II London. Again, the arrival of American soldiers produced a significant boost to trade. As the renowned gay bon viveur and writer Quentin Crisp said of the Americans at that time, labelled with love from Uncle Sam and packaged in uniforms so tight that in them their owners could fight for nothing but their honour, these bundles for Britain leaned against the lamppost of Shaftesbury Avenue or lolled on the steps of thin-lipped statues of dead English statesmen. As they sat in the cafes or stood in the pubs, their bodies bulged through every straining khaki fibre towards our feverish hands. Never in the history of sex was so much offered by so few. Of course, the new American arrivals were ripe for exploitation by men and women. There were plenty of homegrown participants in the London sex boom. Some were happy to just get sex, but many pursued the American soldiers with more malicious intent. A common offence was for a woman to take American soldiers into a dark alley on the promise of sex so that they could be robbed in cooperation with men.
Obviously, venereal disease was rife. Backstreet abortionists did very well for themselves, and the prostitutes did very well for themselves. The going rate for an American soldier was £5, but because the British soldiers were less well paid, they could get a slightly cheaper service.
One professional lady was discovered to have taken 49 men home in one day, according to the evidence when she ended up in court.
So, Mark, one thing that would be interesting to learn about is with any great army, you get large numbers of deserters, presumably. Is that something we see in the crime boom?
Indeed it was. As the troops massed in the early months of 1944 in the UK ahead of D-Day, the problem of deserters on the run became more and more acute. A good many deserters found London to be the best place to hide out, Soho, Fitzrovia and Notting Hill being particularly favoured. It was also the best place to get forged papers. The forgery cases before the courts indicate that forgery of papers was big business. The police found deserters very hard to deal with. According to a senior CID officer in London, of all the lawbreakers the Metropolitan Police had to deal with, deserters were the most difficult and dangerous. Carrying forged papers or not, he said, their worry was the next meal, drop of drink, or bed for the night. They seldom cared how these were obtained. Unsurprisingly, deserters who'd been on commando or special forces training were particularly tough to deal with. The records disclose numerous court cases in which deserters of all nationalities were involved in stealing, robbery, and worse. Perhaps the most notorious deserter crime of the latter years of the war involved a Swedish-American GI called Carl Hulton. When Private Hulton deserted, he got hold of an American officer's uniform and went round posing as such. He managed to attract the attention of a Welsh striptease artist called Elizabeth Jones, who hailed from Neath. Hulton met her in early October 1944 and quickly moved in with her. He had somehow got hold of a US Army truck, and the couple immediately embarked on a Bonnie and Clyde-like crime spree. Having carried out a number of robberies and assaults, on the evening of October the 9th, they decided to rob a taxi driver. They hailed a man called George Heath in Hammersmith and asked him to drive them to Chiswick Roundabout. There they asked him to pull over, and Hulton shot him in the back. Then they robbed him of his cash, watch, and a few other items, and when he died soon after, they drove the car onto Staines, where they dumped him on the common. Heath had a prominent cleft chin, and the murder quickly became known as the cleft chin murder in the press. Hulton and Jones were quickly caught and convicted. Both were sentenced to death, but Jones received a late reprieve. Hulton was hanged in March 1945, while Jones surprisingly served only 7 years in prison. If anyone's interested, a film was made in 1990 based on this murder. It's called Chicago Joe and the Showgirl and features Kiefer Sutherland as Hulton. George Orwell, an aficionado of murder, wrote on the subject in his post-war essay, Decline of the English Murder. He wrote of the cleft chin chase that he thought it symbolized the decline of the English murder. The classics of English murder were usually middle-class domestic and involved sex and poison. The cleft chin murder, though the most talked-of murder of recent years, he said, was distinguished by its brutal casualness rather than by emotion and class. Calls for the girl to be hanged flowed from the brutalizing effect of the war, and he thought the story would not be as remembered as the older cases. On the latter, it seems he was wrong.
So, that's a flavour of the crime boom in World War II London. It surprised me to learn about this boom, as it does many. However, one should bear in mind this criminal activity does not detract, of course, from the millions of honest Britons who fought or resisted the German threat for 5 years of the war. They are all deserving of the highest praise. But unfortunately, evil always rears its head in any circumstance. Next time, it's on to the gangs of London.
Thanks very much, Mark.
Thanks so much for listening. Links are in the show notes. Please share with friends and family, and if you want to get in touch, you can through X or email history@aspectsofhistory.com. But until then, thank you and good night.